Ingram, for whom all of these events for the yesterday, today, tomorrow, all in her honor. And welcome to all the community members, those of you from Willamette University and beyond, for being here today and sharing this space together. I want to respectfully acknowledge the Kalapaya people who are the original stewards of these precious lands for the 14,000 years that they have lived here and still do. But more important than a mention of years, I wanted to remind you of that this amount of time corresponds to nearly 600 generations. However, in the past 8 generations, the Kalapuyans have endured decimation to their traditional lifeways, including genocide, seizing of homeland, forced labor, dismantling of families and cultures, and sexual, physical, and emotional abuse. The establishment of Willamette University on these seized lands was in 1842, directly contributing to the destruction of the ancestral lands and the lives of its original stewards. Willamette's motto, "Not unto ourselves alone are we born," is not fully being upheld every day, contributing to the continuation of ongoing violence and repression of the indigenous people. However, we can use one of our taglines, turning knowledge into action, by using not just our specialties, our favorite things to study, our favorite things to teach, but also how we can contribute to educating ourselves on these enormous issues. By gaining knowledge that will then lead to truth, that is the only way we can move forward to reconciliation. To make real change, genuine change, we need to each commit to learning and then taking action. Let us keep remembering those 600 generations that preceded us and that continue to this day alongside us. Every time we hear, "Not unto ourselves alone are we born," let's think of those 600 generations and what we can do as individuals and as a collective to uphold this motto. Every time we hear, "Turn knowledge into action," let's think of how we can honor those 600 generations and support the current generations and the Kalapuyan and other indigenous generations that will guide our future. I am so grateful for this gathering and for all of you who have come to celebrate our visitor, Jani Ingram, and for this space, so thank you for being here. And I want to welcome Jani and give some information about her if you don't know. Jani C. Ingram, PhD, is a Regents Professor of Chemistry and Biochemistry at Northern Arizona University in Flagstaff, where she has been over 20 years. Dr. Ingram leads a cutting-edge analytical research lab that translates environmental chemistry to health impacts on at-risk populations. Her work provides solutions to complex environmental health issues, including community-driven concerns stemming from environmental injustice issues for tribal communities, such as dealing with legacy mining of uranium as a result of the Cold War. As a dedicated teacher-scholar, Dr. Ingram has mentored over 100 research students, including undergraduates and graduate students. She has made a priority of recruiting Indigenous students and students from other groups that are underrepresented in STEM into her research. She is also director of the Bridges to Baccalaureate program, a partnership designed to develop a diverse pool of research-oriented undergraduates who bridge from Coconino Community College to complete their bachelor's degree in STEM fields at NAU. As a result of her long-standing and impactful work as a mentor, she was named the 2018 recipient of the American Chemical Society Award for encouraging disadvantaged students into careers in the chemical sciences. Her research has been funded by multiple grants from the National Institutes of Health, National Science Foundation, National Cancer Institute, National Institute of Environmental Health Sciences, Environmental Protection Agency, and many more large granting agencies. Dr. Ingram has built a vast network of collaborators from a variety of disciplines and institutions, in order to address important Native American health-related issues, including cancer, COVID-19, and other health inequities. For example, she is the principal investigator of the Partnership for Native American Cancer Prevention, which investigates environmental contaminants on the Navajo Nation lands and their impacts on health. She received her associate's degree from Yavapai College, her BS in chemistry from New Mexico State University, her PhD in chemistry from the University of Arizona, and then she was staff scientist at the Idaho National Laboratory for 12 years before joining the faculty at Northern Arizona University. Dr. Ingram is visiting us for over 2 days, sharing her deep knowledge and insight, as well as her delightful soul. And all of this is part of a Dreyfus Lectureship, which is made possible by the Camille and Henry Dreyfus Foundation. Please join me in welcoming Dr. Ingram.
Thank you very much. Yeah, that's the Dene language. So Yate, She Jani Ingram Yunishe, Naanes Deju Tichini Nishle, Bilagana Bashis Chin, Kintlishini Dashis Che, Bilagana Dashis Nali. So that is for any of my brothers and sisters out there from the Dene Nation or the Navajo Nation. So the Navajo or the people call themselves Dene, which means the people, but sort of the rest of the world knows us as Navajo. So I'm going to talk to you a little bit today about some of the work that we have been doing out on Navajo lands, and then just those pictures are different time frames of the students that have worked in my lab. So, and they're from all walks of life, all kinds of different disciplines. So let's see. All right, so and I want to say hello from Flagstaff. If you haven't been there, it is almost in the center of the state of Arizona, and it is a very beautiful place in the mountains, and we actually do sit at the base of sacred mountains that are the homelands to a number of Native American groups throughout the region, and so we honor their past, present, and future generations. And if you haven't been there, it is a beautiful place to visit. It's full of snow right now, so it's a little bit cold. And then just to give you a little background who I am and why maybe I do the things I do. So one of the pictures, this picture here is, let's see if I get this. So this is my mom, Janice, and my grandmother, Alice, and they're very strong Native women that really have made an impact on who I am. I was born and raised in a small town in Arizona called Kingman, which is not too far from Las Vegas, so it's kind of in the northwestern part. My mom, obviously, that's where I get my Navajo side. My dad was actually born and raised at the south rim of the Grand Canyon, and so the students I talked to this morning, my dad actually wanted to be a cowboy. He grew up in the barns with the mules and the horses, and so I tell people I am the product of a cowboy and an Indian. So so that's them there, and then I'm also a mom. So my husband James is here, and then I have 3 kids, Jordan, Jaleesa, and Joshua, and the biodiversity is pretty large in my family. My son Josh got most of the Navajo blood. My daughter Jaleesa is blonde and blue-eyed, and then my son Jordan looks more like his dad, but they're all really large people. So my husband's 6'6", my kids are 6'5", 6'4", 6'3", and then there's me. And so when I'm with normal people, I'm tall, but not with my family. So, and these are just in the Navajo. I introduced myself in the Navajo tribe is a clan system, and so this really does help people. If you are a member of the Dene or the Navajo, you can see where you have connections to other people. And then this is my other lineage. In Navajo we call white people Bilagana. So and it's funny, my husband knows that word. So when we're at a gathering with our family, and they're like the Bilagana table, he's like, oh. So I'm gonna give you the big picture of what we're doing, and then I'm just gonna focus on a couple aspects of it. And so in my lab, we really look at elemental environmental contaminants, although we're moving toward looking at some organics in a few new projects that I have going on. And so what we do is we work with the communities to understand their concerns, and then we work with the communities to actually gather environmental samples. And so we've looked at water and soil, we've looked at plants and crops, and then some of the livestock, and really trying to understand what are the levels of these contaminants or potential contaminants and how they affect the people there. And really the bigger picture is the ecosystem as well. In the Navajo thinking, we're equal. We're equal to the ants, to the plants, to the different beings, even the rocks and the soils and so forth. So we're just the five-fingered beings, but just trying to see what the impact is of the things that we're interested in. So if you're not familiar, if you've never been to the Navajo Nation, this is a map. So it's located in 3 of the 4 states in the Four Corners area. A lot of it is in Utah, but there's a big portion in, or not Utah, Arizona, a big portion in New Mexico, and then a smaller portion in Utah. And Flagstaff is about right here, so it's considered a border town. And what you see is the different colors. So the different colored regions are called agencies, and I tell people it's kind of like thinking about states within the nation. And then you see smaller borders within those yellow or pink or whatever colored areas, and those are called chapters. And those you can kind of think about as counties. So each of these chapters has its own community government, so there's a chapter president and so forth. And that'll be hopefully important as I go along, that these are communities, and you really have to work together with these communities. And then lastly, in the midst of the Navajo Nation is the Hopi Nation. Totally different tribe. They're more of a Pueblo people. They have different language, they have different ways of living and culture and so forth. And so it's just important to know that there's a lot of diversity amongst indigenous people. And it really is a bit land-based and all those kinds of things. And so if you meet an indigenous person, you want to take the next step and say, well, what tribe are you? So you get to know them a little bit better. All right, so just some facts about the Navajo Nation. There's about, actually there's more, there's like 380,000, I think, with the new census, with about half of the folks that are enrolled members living on the reservation. You have to have essentially at least a quarter native blood to have what's called a certificate of Indian blood, which makes you an enrolled member. So there is poverty out there. There's pretty high unemployment. The education is getting better, but it's still a difficult thing for students to even get to the high school diploma area. It's big as far as the landmass. It's about the size of West Virginia. So I finally went to West Virginia. It doesn't look anything like West Virginia, but that's kind of the size. I think it's the largest landmass reservation in the country. And so importantly, a lot of the homes, because it is super rural, 30 to 40% of the homes, it's estimated, don't have running water or power, or they might have a solar panel to do a few things. And so that, again, is going to be important as I talk through some of the research that we've done. And then folks, not as much as in the past, but they're still sheep herders and ranchers and so forth. So my family actually that lives in the New Mexico side of the reservation does raise livestock. So why am I even doing this stuff? Well, out in the Colorado Plateau, which is where the Navajo Nation lies, there still is, high levels or ore deposits that have pretty good uranium in the minerals. And so there was a big mining boom in the mid-1900s because of the Cold War and the Manhattan Project. And so there was a lot of mining done out on Navajo, and very, well, none of it was cleaned up until just recently. There's estimated at like 530 plus mines that were mined out on Navajo, and there's been like 3 that have been remediated. So there's been a lot of waste left behind, and of course the Navajo people are very, very concerned about that. So this is the map again of the Navajo Nation, but this time it's trying to show you all those 532 mines. So all of the X's are abandoned mines at this point, and so you can see there was definitely sort of mining areas. So over here I'm going to talk a lot about a community, Cameron. There was quite a bit of mining there, and in that case it was open pit mining, which means that they just took the ore from the surface, and so these huge pits that were left behind. We've done some work up here in this area where this is Cove, Arizona, which is where the first mines were dug, and those are underground mines. So you can see there's quite a bit of mining that was done there. My family is from this area of the reservation, and down here in Church Rock, there was quite a bit of mining done at that point. There's actually been one mine that's been cleaned up there. And then up here is, if you are familiar with Monument Valley, beautiful, typically in commercials background. Anyway, this is where Monument Valley, there was quite a bit of mining there. I've had quite a few students from this area. So, like I said, over 500 abandoned mine sites, and there's over 1,200 just mine features where people tried to start mine, and for whatever reason it just wasn't successful. So there's all of this left behind, and so that's why the tribe was just very interested in trying to understand what are the exposures that people get from living in these areas of the mines. So the U.S. government does have some policies to attempt to clean up the mess that was left behind. One of them is the Superfund program. And so this is not just for mining, but this is for all kinds of areas around the country that really need to be cleaned up. And that was started in 1980, as it says. The issue there is that there's a little bit of, in order to qualify to get funding from the Superfund program, you need population density larger than a lot of the areas on Navajo Nation. So they just don't, they can't qualify to get that funding. So another couple policies, the Uranium Mills Tailing Radiation Control Act and the Uranium Mill Tailings Remedial Action, those have also been put in place to try to work through the issues with trying to remediate, but hasn't been super successful. And then the last one is actually a policy of the Dene, or the Navajo Nation, and that was in 2005, the nation said no more mining. So this Dene Natural Resources Protection Act, they said there is no more mining on the Navajo Nation. There's been some pushback depending on the cost of uranium or the price of uranium. Is it, can we still get some, not the Dene, but other mining companies, still want to do some of that mining, and there's been a real pushback on that. So my lab, there's kind of the big picture. Like I said, we talked to our community folks to try and understand, where are there areas that they think need to be investigated, and really looking at the environmental contamination or potential contamination in areas of interest to the Navajo Nation. I'm a trained analytical chemist, and so I don't know a lot of biology. And so I work with a lot of different scientists to really look at these issues. So trying to, as it says, bridge the gap between environmental science and health research. So we work with a lot of environmental science folks, hydrologists, geologists, geospatial people, which is a little bit different, and then true cancer researchers, social scientists, all kinds of folks to really try and look at these very complex issues. And then the most fun that I have is working with students. And so these opportunities to do research really give Native students and non-Native students the opportunity to really make an impact on some of these issues. And so, like I said, you kind of saw a picture. I'll have some pictures at the end of my students. They come from lots of different walks of life, but certainly a lot of Native students are very drawn to these projects. So this is trying to capture what we and why we do things. So in the medical sciences, they talk about bench to bed, which is really translational science. Like, we're not just going to come up with these great therapies or whatever and just publish them and never share them with the world. And so I am very, very, it's very important to me that we as the environmental scientists do the same thing, that whatever information we're getting, we're giving it back to the community. And I didn't have a cool catchphrase for it, but she isn't even in my group, but she heard one of my talks and she's like, well, what about collection to community? And I'm like, that's cool. So that's our new catchphrase. What we try to do is to listen to the community, get their concerns, work with them to go to pull environmental samples and so forth, but then we do all the chemistry and then we give the information back and really see how that can, the information that we get, shape policy for different tribal groups. And so that's really the bottom line. So in order to do this work, I have alluded to it a little bit, lots of collaborators. So certainly the students that work on this, and often their families, because they're from these communities, they give us really those types of insights. Definitely the communities themselves and their leaders. And then most tribal communities, there is governmental structure to it. So actually Navajo has their own EPA group. It's part of Region 9, as well as we work really closely with the Navajo Natural Resources, with the tribal government. We've done some survey work, so human research. So we've had to go through the Navajo Nation Human Research and Review Board, or the Institutional Review Board, if you've done that type of work. Definitely knowing what other people are doing out on Navajo, and you should always do this, right? Who else is doing similar work? How can you work together? Not, really recreating the wheel, that type of thing. And then, like I said, lots of other scientists we've worked with. And so, if you're not familiar with it, Native nations in the United States are sovereign. So what does that mean? That means they have their own governments, and that really they get to decide whether you're going to go onto their lands and do work. And so on Navajo, what you do is you work with the community, come up with your ideas, and then you present them to the community. And so what you end up either getting or not getting is something called a resolution of support. So this is a picture of my student Lindsay Jones, who did a lot of work on water and Western Agency on Navajo, and she's presenting to the Western Agency folks. And we have always been really fortunate to get a lot of support for the work we do, but this is the paperwork or the bureaucracy that says, yes, they do approve, Western Agency approved the work that we're doing. And the way, particularly when you go to the communities, a lot of times it's the elderly that come to those meetings and they vote, yes, we're in favor, or no. And if grandma doesn't want you on their land, then you aren't going to do it. Okay, so it's really important to understand what the concerns are. One example is I knew a researcher at the University of Arizona Cancer Center who was very interested in smoking and smoking cessation and all that, and wanted to do some work on Navajo. Well, Navajo people don't really smoke. I mean, that's a tribe that really doesn't have a lot of folks that smoke, and so there's really wasn't a need for it. And this researcher really just kept pushing, and I'm like, there are so many other issues out there. You know, this is not probably one of them type of thing. And so it's sort of that round peg, square hole type of thing. You know, it really needs to be what the community would like to see. All right, so I'm going to talk about our work that we've done in water and also in some of the livestock work. So these are pictures. This is some of my group up in the Four Corners area, actually as part of a spill that happened in 2015, the Gold King mine spill, where there was a big release of mine waste that came down through the northern part of the Navajo Nation. And then this is us out in the Little Colorado, where is in Western Agency, where we've done quite a bit of work. So, as I said a few slides back, on Navajo there is a number of households that do not have running water. And so people have to rely on whatever water they can haul. And so people sometimes or often use livestock wells, which are what I'll be referring to as unregulated wells. And these are wells that are not monitored, and they really were put in place for the livestock out on Navajo Nation. And so these are just pictures of what these things might look like. They have a lot of different looks. There's a lot of windmills out there. There's hand pumps. There's these areas where you have to drop, you know, like a bucket down there in order to get some water. And so it looks a lot different depending on where you are. And so this is a map again of Navajo Nation, and all these yellow stars are these unregulated wells that my lab has sampled over the years. So every star represents a different unregulated well, and we have collected at least 3 samples at different times from these wells, some of them many, many samples. And so you can see a lot of them are in the western part of the nation, and partly because this is Flagstaff, and so that makes it a little easier to get to. We also have worked really closely with the University of New Mexico. So they're in Albuquerque over here, so they've done a little bit more work on the eastern side of the reservation. So we've tried to work together to marry our data sets. So also on this map, you can see blue dots. Those are wells that we can get data from the Centers for Disease Control and Prevention, CDC. We also have green dots that back in the late 90s, the Army Corps of Engineers did some sampling out on Navajo, and they've published that information. And then there's a few from the US EPA, but not a ton. And so we tried to collect all this information in order to provide to folks. And then the last thing is you can see it has abandoned mines, and these are just sort of hot spots that we know that these wells have had higher levels of, in particular, uranium. So the next couple slides I'm going to show you actual data. But before that, I guess I'm going to, what are we interested in? So mostly we're interested in uranium because that's what the request of the community is. But we also have been looking at arsenic. Arsenic is not a metal, it's a metalloid, and it is very prevalent in the western part of the US. And so we were looking at, in particular, these 2 elements to get an understanding of if there were elevated levels and so forth. So arsenic is known to be a carcinogen. It is also one of those things that if you have underlying health issues and you're drinking water, say, with elevated levels of arsenic, it can just make those health issues worse. If we had a periodic table, it's on the same column as phosphate, so it kind of has that type of chemistry. And then uranium, you probably know, is a radioactive element, but oftentimes people don't think about it also as a chemical or a toxic metal. So when you are exposed to uranium at lower levels, but chronically, you can also have issues with respect to kidney disease, and we think potentially it can cause cancer. So those are reasons why you might want to know how much uranium is in my water, type of thing. So I'm going to show you two plots. The first one is arsenic, and so what you're looking at is concentration on the y-axis, which is in micrograms per liter, which is a part per billion, all right? And then we sampled over 300 wells. It's hard to put 300 bar chart for that. That's just too much. So what this is just is a sampling of different areas on the reservation that we had looked at. And the way we present this to communities is that we put the drinking water standard as a horizontal line. So in your regulated water, the arsenic level is supposed to be less than 10 part per billion. So what we try to tell folks is just if your level is above that line, then the US EPA calls it it's above the maximum contaminant level, and it's probably a good idea not to be drinking that water. So you can see quite a few bars that are above that line. We also, and I'm going to show you a table in a few slides, where some of these wells are approaching that, so it's not quite to 10, or maybe it's plus or minus depending on the day, but it's definitely near that 10 part per billion cutoff. Other wells are below but still detectable, and then some of the wells we are not detecting the arsenic, which is a great thing because it means it's quite low. So similarly, here's the uranium plots. Again, part per billion on the y-axis, same wells listed in the different regions on the x-axis, and the line now, this horizontal line now, is at 30 part per billion. So that's again the maximum contaminant level, and you do see some wells that are higher, some that are kind of frighteningly higher from the different regions. So the student, Jonathan Credo, worked in my lab. He started as a freshman, and he worked all through his undergraduate degree, and he really took on this water project. And so this was a result of a lot of the work that he did, this publication, where it's not just uranium and arsenic, but that's really what I'm showing you here. If you're really interested, go to this paper, because he looked at like 27 different elements. And what he did was to compare that maximum contaminant level to whatever concentrations for those 300 plus wells. And the way he thought it would be good to report it is to look at the different agencies, and then just to count the number of wells that exceeded that maximum contaminant level, that were close to, approached it, that were below the maximum contaminant level but definitely detectable. The BD is non-detect or below detect, okay, and then the total number of wells. And so this was a way to kind of show folks that these different agencies really had different or varying water chemistries, and trying to give that information in a slightly different way. So overall, for our data, what we found was that actually there were about twice as many wells that exceeded that maximum contaminant level for arsenic compared to uranium. And so it was kind of eye-opening, I think, for a lot of the nation, because Navajo was thinking uranium, it was uranium mining, that's the problem, and it's like, I think arsenic is the bigger problem type of thing. We definitely have seen more of the uranium elevated wells near the mine sites. We also have been looking at manganese. It doesn't have a maximum contaminant level, but it's known that if you are chronically exposed to elevated levels of manganese, you can get, it's a neurotoxin. So we've been monitoring that because a lot of the wells do have quite high manganese levels. And then the community asked us to look at mercury, because there's also coal mining that's done out on Navajo, but we really just saw background levels there. So what we're doing now is we continue to give information back to the community. We are watching those chemistry changes over time, so I constantly get new students, so we go out and continue to do water sampling. working also with more the geologists to understand what's the underlying geology, and then what would we expect and how does that maybe differ maybe in these mining areas. I mentioned the University of New Mexico. We were working with them before COVID to really bring together our data set so that there was one big database on the information about the water in on the nation from, you know, west, east to west, north to south. And it turned out that it was really useful information because when COVID hit, it hit Navajo really hard. Like it was at one point, you know, per capita or per persons or whatever, it was the worst in the country. And so what happened was the Navajo Nation took a really aggressive approach and had curfews. So you need to be in your house by 5 o'clock, and lockdowns on the weekend. So people were not supposed to be moving around. The issue was that people could not get their water from faraway distances. So they got stuck at their house and they still need water, but they had to start hauling from many more of these unregulated wells. And so one of my colleagues is a geospatial person, and he put together this awesome website where it's got the map and you could hover over the map and find your well or the well you think you're going to haul from, and it would pull up the data that we had collected. So it gave people that information. And it really was something, like I said, we've been working on, and it really came into a lot of use during the pandemic out on Navajo. And so one of the things, besides trying to give information back to the tribal leaders, is just giving it back to the community directly. And so my student, Lindsay, who I showed a picture of earlier in the talk, she came up with this idea of making a booklet that really tried to spatially give information back. So this, she also published this in this wonderful nice paper here. But what she did was with each of these chapters, so each of the communities, she had the map, and then she showed the exact place where those the water samples were collected. Why is that important? Because these things have like Indian Health Services or IHS designations. So for example, 3K, what is it, 331 is this well here. The community doesn't call it 3K-331, right? It's Auntie's well, or it has some name. And so this way people could see from the map, okay, this is where I haul my water. And then over here, she superimposed the uranium and the arsenic data on the same plot, and again had those dashed or the horizontal lines to say the maximum contaminant level. And she did multiple samplings. So she had that information here, and then a summary of the information above it. And so she did this for each chapter, each community. And then at the end, we had an amazing Navajo student who had really good language skills. So she actually did a summary of her data in Navajo, in the Navajo language. So Lindsay put this booklet together, and then she did, I called it a road show. She went to many of these chapters, talked through the booklet, and handed them out, left copies of it so that people who did not make it to that particular meeting could have the information. And it seemed to be a really useful way to give this information back to the different communities. All right, so now for something totally different, or sort of, kind of. So when we were doing this water work, so I came to NAU in 2002, and I really started doing water almost right away. We would go to the communities and they'd say, well, is there uranium in our mutton? And I'm like, I don't know. I don't even know how to address that. So if you're not familiar with mutton, it is sheep meat, and it is very, very traditional to the Navajo. And so this is a picture of what would be called mutton stew. And then most tribes around the country make this stuff called fry bread because the government gave them flour and salt and lard, and guess what you can make out of that type of thing. So this is, you see this a lot out on the reservation. So what happened was we would, so like probably around your walls, we had posters of the work that my students did up on the walls, and one of the posters was in this Cameron area, and they just took a picture of these sheep grazing on the abandoned mine site. And the janitor from our floor comes into my office and he says, I think those are my sheep. And I'm like, what? And it turned out they were. And that was how we figured out we're going to work directly with this community guy and get tissues from his sheep, and that's how we're going to be able to at least do the analysis. And so that was the start of really trying to address this question of, is there uranium in our mutton? And so just a little background, sheep were introduced to the Navajo by the Spanish, and so they really took to the sheep. And so this is just a picture of some Navajo ladies who normally were the ones that were the sheep herders. The sheep were used for food, but also the wool, the beautiful rugs that you see come from the sheep. And it really was a symbol of the good life. And so for many Navajo people, when they have mutton, it's really a spiritual experience. I tell people it's not like just having a burger. It's, really, really a big deal. And so that's why we had this question over and over and over, because it was just really important to many of the tribal members. So what we did was we worked with the communities, and we got 5 sheep from this Cameron area. So this is the area where there was the open pit mining. So those, in this case, the yellow dots show all these abandoned mines. We thought we would be able to do a reference, not really a control, but a reference by getting sheep from down here in a community called Loop. You don't see any yellow dots there. Turns out that wasn't the best comparator. So then one of my students found a rancher way off the reservation in a town called Ingram, where he was willing to sell us sheep, and so we did some comparison with that group. And then I'll show you a little bit of data, or maybe I don't have any, but we've done some sheep work up here in the Cove area as well. So go to the communities, I'll show you a few pictures. If you're a vegetarian or a PETA person or whatever, I'm sorry, but it's definitely a butcher party is what it is, to collect the tissues and so forth. But collect them, do the chemistry, and then I'll show you a little bit of data. We did some survey work to find out how much sheep or mutton do people actually eat, because it is not as prevalent as before, and so we wanted to get that information. And I have a student that's then going to pull all that information together and work on what's called an indigenous health indicator to really understand that exposure on a more cultural level. And so that's where the research is going. So this indigenous health indicator was developed by the Swinomish tribe, which is in kind of your guys' backyard. They are up in the state of Washington, and really they were looking at shellfish, which is a traditional food to them. My lab has worked with some of the folks that developed this, Jamie Donatuto and Larry Campbell from the Swinomish tribe, and really working to how we can adapt their ideas to the mutton traditional food of the Navajo. So, like I said, we would collect 5 sheep from each site. So the site in Loop is on the Navajo Nation, but there was no mining. Cameron, also on the Navajo Nation, but definitely a mine site. And then Eager was about 100 miles off reservation, no mining. So these are just pictures of my students and actually other students who decided to come help. There's a couple grandmas right here, helping with really doing, we call it Navajo euthanasia, but it's really just a traditional butchering of those animals, collecting different pieces and parts. We also had a veterinarian to come and assess the health of these animals. So this is Dr. Ruby. She's known as the Res Vet. She has a mobile veterinarian lab, so to speak, and so she was actually good friends or the vet for a couple of my students, so she volunteered her time to come do that for us. And so these are all the different organs and tissues that were collected. during the collection time, and so we would have students that knew their anatomy and physiology, identify the pieces and parts, and then we would put them in plastic bags and bring them back to the lab. This is very difficult. This is the analytical chemistry part that is really difficult. Taking a live sheep, which is over here, and getting all the way to the point where you can actually do the analysis. And so if you are in my lab at certain times of the year, you will see not just one clothesline full, but strands and strands of drying meat. Because what we do is the students cut them like you're making jerky, dry the meat, and then put it in some kind of grinder. Oftentimes it is a coffee grinder. Grind it up to the consistency of sawdust, and then put it in a furnace and ash it. So it looks like these are empty now crucibles, but they're actually white ash of the tissue, so that you really mineralize it, and now we can acid digest it and then do inductively coupled plasma mass spec. So that's trace element analysis. One of my students she's finishing up her doctoral degree, every tissue actually ashed a bit different. So she had to spend a lot of time getting here from this point to this point. And so, God bless her. She spent a lot of time figuring that out. And so, the student is Andy Lister. So she did a master's with me, and now she's finishing up her PhD. And this paper was published just to kind of show how well we were doing the method. So it was more of a methods paper, but it was the heart of 5 sheep from Cameron and Loop. What we expected, our hypothesis was that the Cameron data would be statistically different, higher than the Loop. You can see that's not true. So the question was, is this background level? Are these sheep mostly peeing out the uranium? Are they both elevated? What's going on? And so that's why we then collected sheep from eager. And so you can see, even though the standard deviation or the error bars are kind of high here, definitely the eager sheep have lower levels. So this is kidney samples. And so this was one thing we started to think about, well, why is this? And we learned that there's a lot of sheep trading. We did not really know where these animals were grazing from Cameron and Loop. And so the next iteration of this experiment has been in this area of Cove, but we've worked with actually the University of New Mexico, and they collared the sheep so that then they GPS tracked them, and then we could go in and actually collect plants and water and so forth from the areas that these animals were grazing. So it's a little better experiment, and so my student Andy's working through that data right now. So back to the western side of Navajo, this is Cameron. This is the area, the black dots are where we collected these sheep from 3 different families. The X's are sort of trying to show you water or unregulated wells where these livestock would drink that are at levels below what we would call the drinking standard. And then if you go here, there's some of these wells that are much higher. And all the dots are old abandoned mines. So what my student Andy did was then look at the distance from the mine site and then the concentrations of uranium in the kidney. So that's what's shown on the y-axis. The x-axis is the distance from the mines, and as you might expect, eager is much lower. Loop is somewhat on average less than in Cameron. So we're hoping to fill in some of the gap here, like distance, but still on the res. We just haven't collected those sheep yet. So we have this chemistry information, but the question is, do people really eat that much mutton anymore? So we had our own ideas about it, but we had to go in and actually ask people, which for an analytical chemist, not trained in social science, bad idea. So I came up with this questionnaire, and I took it to my social scientist friends, and they're like, what are you trying to accomplish with this? And I'm like, I don't know. So anyway, they helped us to build this survey, and we actually took it from, or adapted it from the Swinomish, who had a similar survey, and definitely lots more approvals needed because it was human research, but I'm going to show you the survey data that we collected from Cameron. So our objectives were really not just how much mutton how much mutton people were eating, but how did they prepare it, and then even more important, what was the cultural significance to them in terms of sheep consumption and potential contamination? How would that affect the culture? And so we have this questionnaire, and on the first page, pretty simple, yes, no questions for the most part, and very much asking questions about, do you think mutton is important for traditions? Would ceremonies be changed if there was no mutton? That type of thing. And then do they raise their own sheep and so forth? And this was actually work for a student who got his PhD a couple years ago, Tommy Rock. So he went out and did these surveys. He surveyed 75 people in the Cameron area, which was no easy task because there's not a lot of folks that live in Cameron. So the second side of the survey was what parts of the sheep are you eating? How is it prepared? And then what frequency? Do you never eat this? Do you eat it every day? And so forth. So trying to collect that information to better understand the exposures. And so just a little bit of the results. You know, do you think mutton is important for traditions? So gender and then age groups. And for the most part, I mean, the y-axis here goes 82 to 100. So people were very much saying, yes, I think it is very important to traditions. And then when do you typically eat this? And definitely family gatherings. And we pretty much knew that. I mean, when people get together for birthdays or Christmas or whatever, I mean, they expect to have their mutton. And so people do eat that quite often. Not as many people have it regularly because it is pretty expensive. And people don't raise as many sheep as they used to. So I would say the information we're getting back is that people don't eat as much as they would, say, other proteins, but definitely it's very important to the tribal people. And so this is just showing you what pieces and parts of the animal that folks eat. I showed you the picture of mutton stew. Not surprisingly, that's what people eat the most, but ribs and so forth. But the Navajo people, like most indigenous people, they eat everything. So if they are raising these sheep, they're going to eat, you know, things like the eyes and so forth. So not as much, because you can actually buy like ribs in the store and that kind of stuff, or at the flea market. But definitely people eat most of the sheep, which is why we went in and looked at different organs and tissues to see, was there more accumulation in some organs and tissues than others? And one of the thoughts is that we could provide a guidance to folks to say, you know, don't eat the kidney, you know, that type of thing. And so because I'm not going to say don't eat any more mutton, but just trying to give that type of guidance. And so overall, the survey results have been really useful. Definitely older folks eat more mutton than younger folks, and that it is very important to the tradition and the culture of the Navajo people. And so now we're still at the point, is there a health risk in consuming mutton? I had a second student, Tasha Nez, who did the same survey but in Cove. So Cove is on the direct opposite side of the reservation, up in near the Four Corners area. A little bit smaller community, but we wanted to see on either side of the reservation, is it comparable? And so right now, actually my student Andy is statistically comparing those, but we did see a lot of the same information. And so with that, with the survey data and then her chemistry data, you know, pulling it together to really try and have this indigenous health indicator in terms of exposure, but on a cultural side. So lastly, I am super excited. I just got a project funded from the American Cancer Society, and it's really to look at the connection or the potential connection between cancer and exposure to the the legacy mining out on Navajo. So this is from the Navajo Cancer Work Group, and what it's doing is showing you different cancers and comparing the in red is the Navajo population, and in yellow is the, non-Hispanic white population. And so you can see in some cases the yellow bars are larger, but this kidney cancer is definitely larger in the Navajo population. Stomach cancer, this partnership that I have on Native American Cancer Prevention, we have a project looking at why that is. Liver cancer is another one. And so the kidney cancer and kidney disease has been related to uranium exposure. And so this project, we actually finally got permission for the hospital in Tuba City, which is in the middle of the Navajo Nation's Western Agency, to look at medical records and to see where cancer incidence is and where those folks lived, and then look at exposures. So that just got funded in December, so we're going to be moving that way. This is something I've wanted to do since I came to NAU, and it's been difficult to get the approval because there's such a small population that if there's not very many incidences in one community, people are going to be like, that's Aunt Jane, or that's, you know, whoever. But I think we've gained enough trust that we can do it without identifying folks. So we're going to be moving toward that. So with that, I'm just going to end a little bit with some of our dissemination and policy work. This is just pictures of some folks from Cameron. This is my student Tommy Rock, now Dr. Tommy Rock. He invited these folks and drove out to Cameron and brought them into NAU, and kind of just to show them what the lab looks like. And then we had a really nice discussion with them after that sort of tour. He also got funding for a series of conferences across Navajo that really focused on the legacy mining, but specific to different areas. So these are really in the four kind of different areas of the Navajo Nation. And like I said, he secured the funding. This is a picture of us in Cameron with, this is Jani C. She was Arizona representative at that time, and then some of the folks in the lab that did the presentations. We also get called upon by some of the other politicians or people of interest that want to understand some of the issues, especially on Western Navajo. So this is a town hall that was sponsored by Representative Tom O'Halloran, who unfortunately didn't get reelected. But he was interested in the issues out in Cameron. This is my former student and now more colleague, Jonathan Credo, doing the scientific expert discussion with the group in Cameron. And they were really looking at issues with the exposure or contamination, particularly with the soil, and potentially doing an agricultural program out there. And then this is a picture, it's really a fake one, but me and Tommy looking at a map. But these are some of the papers that we have published that really try to look at things like having the traditional ecological knowledge be a part of the policy making. You know, how do you develop these types of partnerships with tribal communities, and then some of the lessons learned in doing dissemination work. So, and if you're really interested in this area, there's some really nice books out. Some of them are a little bit older. This If You Poison Us has a really nice combination of community stories, but the geology, the policy, as well as this one, The Navajo People in Uranium Mining. This book was published by Judy Pasternak, who is a LA Times reporter who did a series of articles on the issue of uranium out on Navajo and then put it into a book. So it's pretty useful. I mean, and really helps you to understand the issue a little better. And so with that, I'm just going to acknowledge the people that I work with. Like I said, Jamie Donatito and Larry Campbell from the Swinomish tribe, helping us to understand the Indigenous Health Indicator. Mike Ketter, he's my colleague through being now emeritus at NAU, amazing radionuclide analytical chemist. Definitely the communities that we work with. This Dene Hatopli Association is the Medicine Man Association, so we consult with them on how to culturally appropriately do our research. And then, of course, you can't do science without money. So those that fund our project. And then I'll just leave it with, these are my non-biological children. So I'm their chemistry mom. And so these are just us in all walks of life. This is a more recent picture of 2 of my graduate students at the SACNIS meeting. So with that, I'll open it up to questions. Yes?
I have a question about like PPE. So how do you guys protect yourself and take care of yourself when you're on the field? Like, is there like radioactive suits that you guys are able to put on, or like what is it?
So if you took a Geiger counter out, most of these places would not read. So the radioactivity is, it's close to background because it's not a huge mine tailing area. And people are living there. So I can't imagine us walking out like this and these people are like, what the heck? But definitely gloves and masks if there's a lot of dust and that kind of stuff. More so in the lab, definitely working in the hoods and so forth, but probably a little more exposure even to all the nitric acid that we use for digestion and so forth. But it's really not, there's areas that are hot, and so we try to get students to make sure and take the Geiger counter out to make sure they're not in an area. He was not working for me at the time, but Tommy was in an area up in Utah, and he actually got radioactive sickness because it was pretty hot. And I was like, yeah, again, as his chemistry mom, I'm like, what are you doing? So anyway, but really, because like I said, I mean, this is a picture of us in Cove with a lot of community members, and that's where they did the first mining, and you know, these folks lived there, so, yeah.
See how my voice holds out. Really nice talk, Jani, and
Thank you.
thanks to Dreyfus and the folks at Willamette for having us for this talk. It's really great. So I was going back to the water part of the thing, and you know, you're presenting arsenic and uranium, and I sort of thought they might be co-located because of the mine tailings. But they actually, the one place that you showed us, it looked like they were anti-correlated, which is
Right.
really interesting. Were any of the other toxic metals like cadmium or lead co-located with uranium?
Right, so we don't see much lead, and we see a little bit of cobalt, not much chromium. The arsenic and the uranium are interesting because they are from different minerals, but there are wells where they're both high. I just probably didn't show those wells. And so there has been some toxicology looking at, is that worse, right? If you have both of those things there. But it definitely isn't necessarily, if you see uranium high, you're gonna see arsenic because they really are associated with different minerals. There's thoughts that, you know, arsenic is a pretty high background in the West, and that all this mining has made them more susceptible to transport, so they move. But that's all things that we still need to think about a little bit more. So,
Thank you.
yeah.
I was curious if the uranium and arsenic levels, if there's like, if you know if there's any difference between those that are on the Navajo Nation land versus like water supplies that are not on the Navajo Nation land but are in the same vicinity.
Right. So I know in just south of Flagstaff, the Verde Valley, that there's really high arsenic levels there. And so they actually, this is aside, but postulated, so there was a group of indigenous people called the Sinawa, and they postulate that they were getting arsenic poisoning because they left that area kind of abruptly. But there definitely are arsenic problems. The thing is that if you have regulated water, whoever is regulating it is monitoring it and should be making sure that those levels are drinkable. It's when you move to these sources that are really meant for animals or other things, and they're not regulated, and there's really no filter system, there's no cleanup, that type of thing, that's where it becomes a problem. But there's definitely hotspots of arsenic in the state of Arizona and in that northern Arizona area, so, yeah. Kind of, so you wanna know what you're drinking? Up there?
Yeah, thank you so much. This was really, really enlightening. I'm curious about the Superfund site edict about population density and whether or not there's been an effort to have some exceptions and whether Deb Holland or Pete Buttigieg or someone like that could.
No, I think there's promise.
Okay.
So, yeah, there was one, so the site actually where my family's from in Church Rock, because it's pretty close to Gallup, New Mexico, they did get Superfund money. The one up in Monument Valley isn't near any large population density, so that's where they struggled a bit to get funding for that. So, sadly, you know, you need more people, and yet, are these people gonna move there because it's a hot spot? I mean, it's just crazy, so, but hopefully, I know, Secretary Howland was in Kayenta, which is in the Arizona side of the Monument Valley, like last weekend.
Oh, nice. Okay.
Yeah, one of my colleagues was up there and got the photo shoot and all that, and I'm like, heck, I didn't get to go. But, so, you know, fingers crossed,
Yeah.
that something positive will happen,
Yeah.
so, yeah.
I was curious about, sort of two-parter question. I was curious about what specific areas have a lot of uranium buildup, especially for the sheep, as well as is there anything obvious that you know that has changed in the sheep who are high uranium content?
That's a good question. So, first part, we think, a hypothesis, and this is part of my student Andy's dissertation, is that there's higher accumulation on the western part of the reservation than the northern part, and it's because the difference in the way they mine. So these open pit mines are really large, and they're just, those animals are easily exposed. Or if it's an underground mine, if you can get the shaft closed, and as long as it's not an area where the uranium ore was transported, it's just not as, you know, out there type of thing. And I think she's seeing that in her data. So, and then the second one is it's more talking to the community members, but they talk about the animals, the babies having weird, deformed things and that kind of stuff. But we haven't done enough sheep to be able to answer that question. So, but they definitely, that's partly why they said, is there uranium in our mutton, because our sheep sometimes come out really weird looking, so. Yeah. Any other questions?
Thank you so much for this. Do you have any plans for like water treatment or like talking with policymakers about that?
Yeah, so I'm an analytical chemist, but one of the projects that I work on is with a chemical engineering group down at the University of Arizona. And they have put together a nanofiltration system that is solar powered. And so right now they have about 4 or 5 systems out on the res working on it. I have one of my students, her master's thesis was just how well was it working with reservation water, because they were doing a lot with synthetic water, and there's a lot of salts in the water, so there's work. The difficult thing about like a filter system is if the filter gets saturated with uranium, because of the Dene, the policy act that said no more mining, it also said no more transport. So if you have a filter that's full of uranium, you can't move it. And so it's really a difficult thing. Plus, then you could have radioactivity because you're essentially concentrated it, you know, so it's tricky. But there are systems, there's a couple of other types of systems out there, but that one is one that we're directly working with folks on. So it seems promising. The problem with some of it is that some of those systems are meant to be running 24/7, and you can't really do that because you waste water that way, and so turning them off and on isn't the best. And then, like I said, the saltiness of the water is also a problem, so, but trying. So, any other questions?
I was wondering if you had any advice for people who are hoping something to get into chemistry that also addresses these environmental and social issues for someone who is currently in undergrad?
I would say, this is my thought, and maybe that I wish I did this more, but is to really focus on, if you want to be a chemist or a hydrologist or geologist, to focus on that, but to definitely, and y'all are the best at this, right, liberal arts colleges, to take courses in more of the social sciences, or social sciences, so you can understand how this all works together, and then really looking at collaboration, because I've said this to a few people, scientists can say, how hard can that be? I can do that, even though I have zero training in social science and making surveys or whatever. And so you really want to say, who is the expert in this, and like come together. But I would say taking some of those classes so you have a better understanding, because I certainly barely did that. And so I'm learning now. And I'm fortunate, my daughter's a sociologist, so I learned from her, so it's all good.
So I believe the state of Arizona, all 3 universities have gone to a tuition-free policy for Indigenous students starting, I think, this year, or next year, if not. How do you think that's going to change your lab and your student population?
Right, so I don't think Arizona State has. I think the other 2 of us have, but I'm excited because a lot of students, it definitely is a hindrance. So we, at our school, and I'll just speak for Northern Arizona University, have a ton of support systems. So we have a cultural center, we have a lot of programs for students to be successful that come from Indigenous backgrounds. So I'm just hoping that it'll just increase, the opportunities for more and more students, kind of thing. But we'll see. We'll see what will happen with that. So, because it starts fall 2023. So, yeah. All right, great questions. Thank you so much. And yeah.
Before we finish, I'd like to introduce you to Maya from the Native and Indigenous Student Union.
Oh, okay.
So I'd like to.
Oh, presents. Oh, yay. Everyone likes a little swag, right? Oh, that's awesome. Thank you so much. That's wonderful. Oh, beautiful.
And there's things inside the bag.
Oh, okay. All right. Oh, a shirt. Yay. Oh, no, a hat.
Yes, and you should show them the hat. So, feeling good, but it's from our public health. So
Oh, okay. Very nice. Very cool. All right.
It stands for Public Health Ethics, Advocacy, and Leadership.
Okay, someone's gonna need to write that down for me. It looks like a Willamette pen. Yes, very nice. I'll have to show this. I have a colleague who went to school here. He'll be very jealous. And then
It's wrapped, but just to keep it safe.
oh, okay.
Sorry.
All right. Just be sorry for giving out gifts. Feels fake. Oh, a poster. Very cool. Oh yeah. It'll go on my refrigerator at school. So
you're the lumberjacks, we are the bearcats.
yeah, very nice. Very nice. Yeah, it's funny because I was a wildcat, Arizona wildcat, and it's mostly bear down, and I have to like now jack up. Actually, it's go Jacks. But anyway, thank you so much.